So for the LLC project this year, I decided to research the effect of gender in the process of indigenous decolonization. So, in order to begin researching, I decided to focus on how gender identities are valued or devalued in the process of indigenous decolonization. And I sought to find the moral reasoning and the reasonings from like social histories that had led to this stratified gender suppression in these settler cultures in post-colonial nations. And in addition to that, I was trying to identify like modern day movements that seek like the rebirth of indigenous ways of living and giving life back to indigenous customs that were abolished upon settler influence. So my thesis argument was that the coalescence of Christian, colonial, and patriarchal social values eliminated pre-existing social orders that gave priority to indigenous ways of knowing that viewed all genders equally. And I think that's wrong. So a lot of these heteropatriarchal systems that replaced the indigenous ways of living that were already in place largely erased all the gender equality traditions that were present in these indigenous communities. So settler colonialism is largely characteristic of Christian conquerors, and the majority of them would replace these indigenous civilizations with what they were calling superior or more civilized social hierarchies. And this was essentially just women becoming subordinates within society and elevating men to higher societal prestige. And women were stripped of their rights. They were taught that their role was in the home and not as the breadwinner or provider for a family. Gender equality was just destroyed and replaced with these patriarchal values that see women relying on men to guide them through life. And this constant subordination of women has effectively led to long histories of sexual violence and harassment within indigenous communities, and that's really large part due to their intersectional identities as both an indigenous person who is largely underrepresented within many governments in post-colonial nations, but also in cultural histories and how much that's valued in terms of the gendered importance of cultural traditions within indigenous groups. So, in large part, the biggest challenge for a lot of these groups is to find that history because of how genocidal the policies of these Christian settlers and conquerors were. They weren't seeking to maintain the good parts of indigenous ways of life or something. They were just destroying it, erasing it completely, and replacing it with what they considered to be something that was going to civilize the people and turn them away from their inferior primitive ways. But really, that ended up seeing the gendered stratification and creation of social hierarchies in a lot of these nations that had never created policies based on gender, had never created stuff that was meant to suppress women and suppress women's rights. And in light of this and the way that these traditions have really bled into modern day culture, many indigenous women have seen the need to create these movements that will create changes and establish gender equality within the world again. And a lot of this, it has to do with how Western popular culture has provided some platforms for them to finally find a voice. So some of the movements include social media movements like Mi Primero Coso and Me Too. And These are very important movements because they call out sexual harassment and violence against women in general, but it has provided a good platform for Indigenous women to come out against their perpetrators and tell their stories and feel empowered from finally getting it off their chest and into the air that they're a victim. And it really rejects Gayatri Spivak's contention that the subaltern can't speak. And it's very empowering for victims just to tell their stories. If even if no justice comes from it, it's very empowering to tell that story of oppression. So in addition to that, movements like Drag the Red and Bear Clan Patrol seek to find disappeared Indigenous women and seek to keep count and document the number of murdered Indigenous women that go, and their murderers go either there's no justice for them, or they never get confirmed as guilty or have light prison sentences. So because of this, because of the intersectional nature of the Indigenous people's identities, they have to form these own movements because they don't feel like their needs are being addressed enough within the over encompassing movements. So popular culture really plays into how the continuation of these heteropatriarchal values continue to find their way and destroy Indigenous ways of knowing and destroy the ideas of gender equality within these Indigenous groups. And films like Pocahontas do that by making the Indigenous woman, look very weak and submissive to the white male who is always, conquering the day and saving everyone, and everyone's relying on them. And in Chavez as well, which regards Cesar Chavez's farm worker union movement, that leaves out women like Dolores Huerta and other women who played vital roles in Chavez's movement to unionize those people. And it just basically leaves out completely. I mean, some of the women that were vital role players in that ended up with no screen time. And that just largely shows the neglect of female contribution in a lot of these post-colonial societies. So when female participation and accomplishment goes unrecognized like this, it ends up continuing the male dominance within that nation, because it discourages women and underrepresented genders from approaching political office and trying to run for something and trying to create change and destroying the stratified nature of these Indigenous communities that they're living in, where women and underrepresented genders are just so largely like they're victims of so many forms of oppression, and they need to find a way to establish themselves within the government so that they can start creating some positive social change for themselves. So one of the things I did to look at how this Indigenous movement works within governments was the term Chachawarmi of the Aymara people who are native to Bolivia. So the term in the Aymaran tongue is understood to be dual-parted, and Chacha stands for the equality of genders, and Warmi stands for the union of the two, which creates societal harmony. And so in modern day, Evo Morales has claimed that he is applying this version of Aymara and Chachawarmi by establishing a 50% women cabinet, but really very few Indigenous women made it into that group of women that are on the cabinet, and none of them get to participate in deciding how women's policy and policies that are seeking for gender equality are established. That is all left up to the middle and upper class women of the nation, and it largely leads to stratified women's rights within Bolivia. So the second text I looked at was a uh, detailed history of how women in Guam are discredited for their societal contributions prior to Christian intervention. And so, like before the Christians got to Guam, when women and men were very equal and they both contributed to society in various roles. So some women were breadwinners and provided for the family, and some men stayed home. Some it was a more traditional Western setup. But upon Christian colonization, there was no longer a choice. Women were placed into roles as homemakers. Males were elevated as the ideal gender within society. And the biggest problem within Guam is that this lack of accreditation of women in terms of the historical foundation of Guam has never been corrected in the history textbooks. It's continued to accentuate these heteropatriarchal norms and continue that dominance in present day, and it effectively shows that women are continually oppressed in indigenous cultures today. So these are my sources, and thank you for watching my video.